We're going to speak now to Ben Fletcher, who was the first deafblind candidate for MP in the UK, who's also a principal engineer at the Financial Times. Hello, Ben.
Hello. Yes, you're right. I currently have a different role in the FT, but you're right, I was a PE previously.
I do beg your pardon. What's your current role?
I'm actually a software engineer currently, so slightly fewer responsibilities, but very exciting work.
I'm a big fan of fewer responsibilities. Um,
Absolutely.
perhaps the big theme to the episode is about who our country is set up for. And if this isn't too big a question, I wondered if I could ask you to talk about the fixable ways in which life in the UK is made more difficult for you as a deaf person.
That is a big question. Um, well, when I was actually born, my parents, they're not deaf, and they'd never met deaf people before. When they realized that now they had a deaf child, they asked the professionals what they should do. And the professionals said, we need to try to make sure that he can speak using his voice, and hopefully he'll be able to hear and lip read when he grows up. So my parents went along with that, but that obviously didn't work well for me. My language development was very slow, and I was way behind other children in nursery, which everyone thought was unusual, a bit strange. But then they found out about British Sign Language, and my parents, or the professionals, had never told us about that previously. So they did some research. They went to deaf clubs and realized that there's a full, rich visual language out there that people are using every day. So my parents realized that is what I would need. So they started campaigning to the council saying our son Ben needs British Sign Language. They didn't know, the people in the nursery didn't know anything about BSL, so they brought in a tutor to teach me some sign language. And after lots of campaigning, it was finally agreed that I could have a deaf tutor, deaf sign language tutor, which completely changed my life. Made me who I am now, my identity as a deaf person, using full and complete language, sign language, and improve my confidence. And as you said, I stood for Parliament. I'm working at the Financial Times now, and sign language has been vital to me. And there's lots of barriers that we face in the UK still, in education, health, in everyday life. And I could go on. I wonder if you have any further questions.
Well, just on that. I mean, I know, for example, when your wife gave birth, this was something that factored into it, and this is something that I, as a hearing person, would have been, I'm ashamed to say, ignorant about without knowing your story.
Yes. Um, my partner is hearing, and she's great at sign language. We've been together a long time, and now we have a baby. And when she was pregnant, we had to go for a scan to make sure that everything was okay, check the baby's heartbeat, etc. So we went for the first scan to the hospital. And I asked for an interpreter to be booked who was familiar with deaf-blind hands-on interpreting. and an interpreter was at the hospital. And so they turned the lights out. As you know, the room goes dark. And I was really amazed to see the image on the screen, but I couldn't make out what was what. So I asked the interpreter to relay this information for me from the person doing the scan. They said they didn't know hands-on sign language, so they weren't able to tell me anything that was going on, which was really frustrating for me. And then also, when baby actually arrived, it was a home birth because we wanted to be in a nice, relaxed home environment. So on that day that Lauren's waters broke, the person who was supposed to come and supervise the birth came over, and there was a panic all of a sudden, and they called an ambulance. I couldn't follow what was going on because they were just speaking to each other. And I didn't know if the baby was at risk of dying, and I was really stressed about that. The ambulance came. I tried to write notes to the nurse to find out what was going on, but they weren't able to effectively to communicate with me even that way. And I was completely in the dark, no communication whatsoever. And my partner wasn't able to translate for me because she was obviously in the middle of the baby arriving, so very stressful.
And is your baby okay, Ben?
Yes. The reason the ambulance came, I only found out later. And it was because there was meconium, the baby's first stool, in the amniotic fluids. And that's why they said we couldn't do a home birth. It was just a precaution. And they had to take Lauren to hospital. So the baby was absolutely fine. But I didn't know that at the time. I just wish I'd known at that moment rather than finding out later on.
And how old is your baby now, Ben?
3 now. He's very, very bright, very clever, full of love.
And is your baby hearing? And are you teaching your baby sign language?
I don't know whether you've seen the film Coda that's on Apple TV, which is the child of deaf adults. So my son is hearing. So he's can be referred to as a coda, a child of having a deaf parent, a child of deaf adults. So yeah, he's going to be bilingual. He'll be able to speak and use sign language as well, which is wonderful. And it's beautiful to see. I'm very, very proud that he's acquiring both languages.
And obviously, you made reference to this earlier, that campaigning has been a big part of your life. Your mother wrote a book, Ben's Story, A Deaf Child's Right to Sign. And I think there was a documentary film about your first year at nursery too. I suppose that has taught you that there is a real need to fight for change, which is what your mother obviously did.
That's exactly right. In 1982-ish, and now in 2022, we still face many of the same barriers. It's an ongoing battle, and my mum taught me how to campaign, and I'm still campaigning. When I was younger, I didn't have any access to language, as I mentioned, and now I'm older. It's difficult to access politics. It's difficult to access medical care. So yeah, I'm still campaigning.
And what have those years of campaigning taught you about, I guess, the obstacles to change and the willingness to change on the part of institutions, systems, individuals?
Yes, to all of those. I have tried to escalate things, but they are constantly excuses, and it's a big effort to try to escalate those things. I've often felt like an alien in my own country. People don't know who I am. People don't understand deaf people. People don't understand the sign language I'm using, and I've felt like a foreigner in my own country. When I mentioned about the hands-on experience in hospital and the issues I had with the baby scan, I tried to escalate that, but they refused to accept anything. So legally, there's no backing for us, there's no support for us to take that any further.
And that's why this bill is important.
Yes, I've been following its progress, and it's great, and I would hope that I would be properly recognised then, and I would no longer feel like an alien. I'd feel like a British person using BSL, which is recognised as a proper language. The bill is a private member's bill, and I think it's going to have limited powers. So I'm not sure it's actually going to be everything that we need, but I think it's important that BSL is recognised, and hopefully following that, things will get better. There'll be more momentum, but as a first step, it's okay, but there are still many barriers that need to be removed.
Now, Ben, in 2017, you became the first deaf-blind candidate to run for a seat in the House of Commons. Talk to us about what that experience was like and what the reaction was to your candidacy.
That's right. In 2017, I stood for the Green Party, and I did meet lots of people when I was canvassing with an interpreter, and the response was generally positive. But it was frustrating because at that time, there was no support to provide access. So we had to raise funds for interpreter costs. But we're supposed to live in a democratic country, and people should have access to politics. But people such as myself don't have that equality of access. So we had to raise funds to pay for interpreters, and we did several events. But the main thing that stands out for me is I went to the AGM of the local Green Party, and there was a discussion on finances, and they put some information up on the screen, and they'd raised £300, which is not a huge amount of money in politics by any means, but they had raised £300. And nearly all of that £300 had actually been spent by the party on access for me, which I thought was really embarrassing. That should have gone on resources, campaigning, leafleting, canvassing people. It shouldn't have been spent entirely on my access needs. So, yeah, that's how I felt about that.
So that feels like it should be something that's, I don't know, part of the Electoral Commission's job to fund that. That shouldn't be a concern of an individual candidate.
I completely agree. I would love to see equality of access in politics. I really would.
So on the why, not just elected representation, but on wider representation. Role models are hugely important in terms of how people feel included and valued, and also aspirationally as to what they can achieve. And it seems to me that the number of high-profile deaf people isn't at all proportionate to the number of deaf and hard of hearing people in society, in the country. Do you have any thoughts on why that is and what we could be doing better?
Yes, that's very important. In my work, I don't have a person like me that I can aspire to be like. I'm constantly having to break through those glass ceiling barriers myself. And it's hard to become the role model because of the barriers I face. Recently, we had Rose on Strictly Come Dancing, which was a massive achievement for her. And I watched her success that was noticed around the world, and it really made me cry. Actually, it was such an emotional, such a powerful thing to see her breaking through barriers and reaching where she did. And politics doesn't have any deaf representatives. So yes, it's a good question. We need access in education to improve, which would then lead on to further opportunities for deaf people to be able to access things such as politics. So there would be more deaf people who are knowledgeable about politics as well.
Now, our listeners are always interested in what they can do individually. Is there something that people who aren't part of the deaf community often miss or often get wrong just because it's not based on our experience?
I think I would start with education, because when my parents learnt to sign to be able to communicate with me, the problem was there weren't any courses available for them to learn sign language at that time. Now there are many courses available, but they are not cheap. And lots of hearing parents who have deaf children might not be able to afford to go on those sign language courses, which I think is a real shame. So if the government could support parents of deaf children to learn sign language, that would be a big positive. In education and schools, there are lots of deaf children who have a teacher of the deaf, but many of those teachers of the deaf only have basic sign language skills. So they can't have the real in-depth conversations with the children. And often communication support workers are used, CSWs, to support the children. And again, that's a kind of a basic level of sign language that they use. So the quality of sign language teaching in schools is not great. So if the government could standardize a high level of communication with deaf children in schools, that would be a real positive. And at universities also, I think the government should make sure that we have access so we're able to represent ourselves, rather than, as I mentioned, about having to raise funds for interpreters ourselves. So if we were able to access politics, and then we can influence the changes that we need.
Well, Ben Fletcher, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been such an enlightening conversation to hear about your experience. Thanks for being our guest today.
Thank you, Ben. It's been I found it very, very inspiring.
You're very welcome. It's been really nice to meet you both. And I think the Reason to be Cheerful podcast is really important in today's world, which is quite depressing currently. So thank you to you both.